Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I thought I would do a video in conjunction with Jane Austen July in which I evaluate the marriages that are represented or depicted or talked about or arranged in the works of Jane Austen. So before I go any further, let me point out several things. Number one, I'm not a Jane Austen scholar. Number two, I just finished reading the last of Austen's six, I guess, what people consider major works, even though every time I say that, I feel bad about Lady Susan because I haven't read that, but that's what I'm going to go with here. And then number three, I am relying a lot on my memory because I've read some of these books over a long period of time. It's been a while since I reread Pride and Prejudice or Persuasion, so it's possible I don't get all the details right. And then finally, this is speculative, because what I'm going to be doing in this video is evaluating how well I think, or how good I think the marriages that are depicted in Jane Austen's novels work out. And I'm going to rank them from 1 to 7, 7 being the worst, 1 being the best. And this is just totally based on my impression of the characters as they're represented, and kind of their backstories and kind of how they interact with one another. But I thought this would be kind of a fun thing to do for Jane Austen July. So at number 7, I have the marriage between Marianne Dashwood and Colonel Brandon. Marianne Dashwood is 16 years old during the novel Sense and Sensibility, in which she's one of the two primary heroines. She's romantic, she's independent-minded, she's stubborn, she's talented, she's beautiful, she's passionate. She falls in love with, Willoughby, who's the bad boy in the novel, and has her heart broken. And then Colonel Brandon, a well-established, wealthy, kind, helpful, solid member of the community, essentially falls in love with her and steps in to pick up the pieces. One of the things I'm going to be pointing out in all of these marriage evaluations where I can is the age difference, and I believe this is the greatest age difference that exists between two characters in Jane Austen's works who get married. Marianne is 16 and Colonel Brandon is 35. Colonel Brandon, for all of the great things there are about him, and he is, I believe, a wholly admirable character, his falling in love with Marianne Dashwood is troubling. Not just because she's 16, because obviously during this kind of Regency period, marriages between young girls or teenage girls and men in their 20s and 30s were not that unusual and were not considered to be scandalous. But it's Colonel Brandon's backstory which makes me worried about this marriage. Colonel Brandon, as a young man, fell in love with a woman named Eliza. He was forbidden to marry. She, went off and essentially fell into disrepute. She had a daughter who Colonel Brandon is then the ward of. And Colonel Brandon's ward and Marianne are essentially the same age, which is in and of itself really troubling. But we learn that Colonel Brandon falls in love with Marianne because he reminds her of Eliza. I don't think you ever want to marry someone who sees you as a doppelganger for someone they were once in love with, for an unrequited love. That seems like a bad situation for a marriage. And I can't imagine Colonel Brandon being happy with Marianne as his wife for very long. I can't imagine Marianne and Colonel Brandon's ward necessarily getting along completely. I mean, how weird would it be to have somebody who is 16 be your stepmother when you're essentially the same age? There are just problems there. And so to me, that is the worst marriage. That will be the worst marriage moving forward. Now, the good news, I guess, for Marianne and maybe for Colonel Brandon as well is that at the age of 35, life expectancy being what it was during this period, he's probably going to live another 10 years. On average, if that, leaving her, a wealthy widow at the age of 26, very marriage eligible, and maybe, she could get married again. And I'm not saying the two aren't in love with one another. I'm just saying, from Marianne's point of view, she seems to fall in love with Colonel Brandon because of his kindness to her, and because she had her heart broken, and she's almost like she's convinced that he is a substitute, that he will make a good marriage. And that just sounds iffy to me. So at number 6, I have the marriage between Eleanor Dashwood and Edward Ferrrars. This is the one that I understand the least. Throughout the novel Sense and Sensibility, we are shown Eleanor being incredibly capable and smart and loyal and practical, and yes, she has deep romantic feelings for Edward Ferrrars, who she kind of longs for in a way which is almost makes you sad, because she and her part of her family are clearly on the way down in society, and it seems like that love will go unrequited. For his part, Edward Ferrrars just seems like a complete nub to me. He's wishy-washy. His mom pushes him around. He seems to have kind of, I don't know, flirted with Eleanor, knowing he couldn't marry her. He only is able to marry her because other things work out, and what's her name, Lucy, marries his brother, which is weird in and of itself. And then he's able to marry Eleanor, who, I believe he loves and has feelings for, but this just feels odd. It feels like a marriage of unequals. Eleanor is clearly a better, stronger character than Edward. Why she loves him is a mystery to me. I do think, that she will work to make the marriage as good as it possibly can be, but she will recognize, in my opinion, as we move forward, again, this is all speculative, she will recognize that she married a nub, that she married somebody who isn't her equal, and that will, inevitably, not I mean her equal intellectually, I just mean her equal in terms of character, that will inevitably, I think, put a strain on their marriage. And Edward may not recognize that Eleanor isn't happy. As a matter of fact, I doubt that he would. But I think that Eleanor at some point will become unhappy. So my number 5 worst marriage, or my number 5 marriage in terms of speculating what happens after the book is over, is the marriage between Emma and Mr. Knightley. By the way, if you have not seen Britta's video in defense of Emma, Britta Bohler made a video in defense of Emma, which I thought was just great. I'll leave a link to it down below. You should go look at it, because a lot of what I'm going to say here is kind of based on what Britta said and based on some ideas that I had about this marriage. So, in this is another marriage between people who are where there's a really big age gap. Emma is 21 at the beginning, or when we see Emma maybe in the novel, and I believe Mr. Knightley is 37. That's a 15 or 16 year age gap between the two, and I think that explains a lot about the relationship. Emma is bright, she is vivacious, she is independent, she has no intention of getting married. She's meddlesome, she's snobby, she's a little bit self-centered, she doesn't necessarily, treat other people the way she should, but at the same time she is kind and she is charitable and she does want to help people. She just has very kind of class-oriented ideas. She can be sharp-tongued, she can be mean. In other words, she is a complex person. For his part, Mr. Knightley is pedantic. He's always seems to be trying to teach Emma a lesson. He is sometimes mean, I think, in the way he talks to Emma and the way he instructs her, which I think is actually counterproductive for his ends, which are not necessarily wholesome ends, by the way. But he is kind. He is generous. He is truly a friend of the family. I do think it's a little weird that, his brother married Emma's sister, and that they end up in a romantic relationship with one another. But what worries me the most, and I think this is something that Britta pointed out, or a commenter on Britta's video pointed out, is that really one way of looking at what Knightley is doing throughout the book is he is grooming Emma to become the kind of woman he thinks he could marry. Well, that's disturbing, and that is particularly since Knightley tells Emma that he fell in love with her when she was 13. I don't care what's accepted in the Regency period or not. A grown man, who I think he would have been 29, falling in love with a 13-year-old, that seems more than a little problematic. And then spending his life, spending the next 8 years of Emma's life, instructing her and trying to groom her into being what he sees as a better person, is incredibly problematic. And to be honest with you, I just think that after their marriage, Emma will keep being sharp-tongued, independent, stubborn, and he will not be happy that that his attempts to make her into the ideal wife for himself have failed, which is a good thing. Since he is older, I believe he is the oldest hero in any of her novels. Since he is older, he's likely to live the shortest amount of time, and therefore he will likely die sometime in his 40s, leaving Emma a wealthier, more well-positioned widow in her mid-20s. And then Emma can go on and have the life, I think, that it's fun to imagine her having. A life as an independent woman, a life where, you know, she gets to choose and she doesn't have to get married. Unlike, you know, a lot of Austen's heroines, Emma doesn't have to get married. She chooses to get married, which is what makes her decision to get married to Mr. Knightley seem so unusual. Perhaps she marries him because he's the only eligible marriageable man left in her community. Perhaps she marries him because she has, and as the novel indicates, she does have and has had feelings for him for a long time. She doesn't realize their love until kind of she sees Harriet as a threat, perhaps, or until Harriet falls in love with Mr. Knightley. Only then does she see him as a character or somebody with whom she could fall in love. But this just doesn't feel like it's going to be a happy marriage. And somewhat like I said about Eleanor Dashwood and Edward Ferrrars, I see it as a marriage of unequals, that character-wise and spirit-wise, I don't think Mr. Knightley's any match for Emma. And I think that's going to make him unhappy, and that's fine with me that he's unhappy because, you know, he's kind of a creepy jerk. And Emma seems to me to be, by the end of the novel, much more aware of the damage she can do, much more mature in terms of not wanting to hurt other people and realizing how she can, which I view as good things. Not because they make her more acceptable to Mr. Knightley, but because they make her, you know, a better person. So at number 4, I have the marriage between Fanny Price and Edward Bertram. Fanny in Mansfield Park. Fanny Price is a very moral, upstanding, loyal, capable, helpful young woman who is, you know, is constantly made aware of her kind of dependency on the Bertram family, and occasionally by her Aunt Norris made to feel guilty about it and kept in place by that. But she is not broken in spirit. She is a strong young woman who knows what she believes and is not willing to compromise those beliefs for convenience, either of herself or necessarily the convenience of other people. Her love interest is her cousin Edward Bertram. There is a 6-year age difference between them, with Edward being that 6 years older. Edward is his father's favorite, even though he's the youngest. He is upstanding, he is moral, he wants to be a clergyman. Unfortunately, Edward Ferrars, for the entirety of the novel, really is in love with someone else. And he's not in love with Fanny Price, and Fanny falls in love with Edward in part because he's the first person who's really kind to her, who's openly kind to her. It's almost, I think, like a Stockholm Syndrome thing. You know, Fanny's almost like a captive in the Bertram home, and she comes to believe about herself what those people say until Edward comes along and says, no, you know, you're worth kindness, you're worth consideration, you are in of yourself extraordinary, which is all good marks in Edward Bertram's favor. But, you know, it is to me a little weird they're first cousins, and I realize that's not, that also wasn't necessarily as frowned on then as it is now, in part because eligible men among, you know, different social classes were a little bit more scarce. But to me, this is a marriage based on admiration. And since it's a marriage based on admiration, I think it's a marriage that will be happy. Happy if relatively passionless, but a happy marriage. If two people admire one another, that can be the basis for a solid marriage moving forward. And so I don't see Edward and Fanny being unhappy. I think they fit well together. I think their characters fit well together. They agree on most things, and they have good reason to admire one another. So there are far worse reasons for getting married. For instance, like Mr. Knightley grooming Emma into being his perfect wife, or Emma marrying Mr. Knightley only after she realizes that other people might see Mr. Knightley romantically, and she realizes there aren't really any other eligible men around. those seem like bad reasons. Mr. Brandon's reasons, or Colonel Brandon's reasons for marrying Marianne, because he's kind of obsessed with this woman needing to marry when he was younger, or Eleanor's reasons for marrying Edward Ferrrars, that she fell in love with him and has had this unrequited love for a long time. Those seem like a lot shakier foundations than Fanny and Edward's marriage. And so I think that will be a happy marriage. At number 3, in terms of, future marriages and their happiness or how they work out, at number 3, I have Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth, as we all know, is independent-minded, sharp-tongued. She is loyal to her family. She is opinionated. She's a little bit brash. She is, in lots of ways, really attractive and enchanting if she's a little bit quick to judgment. Mr. Darcy is handsome, he's rich, he is socially awkward in large part because he has a lot of pride in who he is and his position. He, at the same time, is kind. He is more than happy to help out Elizabeth's family once he falls in love with her. He is compassionate and kind to his sister as well, who is kind of his dependent, and he is protective of her. And these two meet and clash, famously. And then they kind of fall in love as a result of that clash. Well, to me, that means their relationship is kind of based on heat. They both, for whatever reason, find the other to be, well, as the kids used to say, hot. Elizabeth finds Mr. Darcy attractive and hot because of his apparent indifference, because he is so prideful. She's attracted to it because she wants to kind of break it down. And then she finds out later that he is not what she thought he was, that in addition to being tremendously wealthy, and I have to tell you, I have suspicions about Elizabeth's change of heart towards Mr. Darcy being related to his wealth. Not just that he was wealthy, but how he used his wealth to help her family. I believe definitely influenced her decision or feelings for him. That she feels that way about Darcy, and for Darcy, Elizabeth is that unattainable kind of attractive young lady who is the one woman who apparently won't chase him, and that makes her somewhat irresistible. So what I'm saying there is that the basis for the marriage between Darcy and Mr. Bennet is, well, sexual attraction. And there are worse things to base a marriage on. It's not the best thing, perhaps, to base a marriage on, but there is a lot of that kind of tension, that romantic tension and sexual attraction between the two, which should lead to a really passionate marriage in every sense of the term. Not the least in which I can only imagine the two clashing over and over again over all kinds of issues upon which they disagree. And it would be one of those relationships where there's a fight and then they make up and we move forward from there. And, I think that could make for a successful marriage. It's also important to note that divorce among these people is essentially impossible. And then once they make these marriages, no matter which marriage I've talked about, they're more or less stuck. And so there's always going to be an element of making the best of it. But I think Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth are going to be happy 60% of the time, and then kind of deliciously angry at one another a good portion of the time. So at number 2, I have the marriage between Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney. The age difference there. By the way, the age difference between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth is only about 6 or 7 years, which is small for a small age gap for a Jane Austen novel. The age gap between Mr. Tilney and Catherine Morland, I believe, is 8 years. I think she's 17 and he's 26. Catherine Morland is naive. I think that's her number one characteristic. Even though over the course of the novel she becomes less naive and she begins to understand kind of motivations and the good and the bad of people as you go on. She has a romantic imagination. She, is famously affected by her love of Gothic novels, and she makes up all these fantasies in her head. And over time, she falls in love with Henry Tilney, and I think Henry Tilney is an attractive hero for a Jane Austen novel. He is thoughtful, he's a thinker, he's intelligent, he's well-read, he's kind, he can also be mean and sarcastic. He's occasionally, I think, a little bit obtuse about what's going on around him, but he essentially grows to love Catherine Morland after spending time with her. And even, when his father objects because Catherine Morland isn't going to inherit a lot of money, he still pursues her. And I think that's because he falls in love with her. You know, clearly Catherine Morland falls in love with Henry Tilney. Tilney falls in love with her. And so I believe their relationship, their marriage, will be based on that kind of romantic love. And again, that's a pretty good thing to base a marriage on, those actual feelings of love. And I think the two fit together well. You know, it's not just they fall in love. You know, what I worry about with Elizabeth Bennet and Darcy is that this kind of sexual attraction, this heat that exists between them, led them to fall in love. And how long will that last, and how will they deal with it afterwards? I think there's a little bit, believe it or not, from my point of view, the marriage and the love relationship between Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland is more sober, is a little bit more, you know, based on actual feelings and emotion and not just heat. And so I think they will have a happy marriage. Not a happy marriage in the sense that I described with Fanny Price and Edward Bertram, where it's a happy marriage based solely on admiration, but a marriage based on love and passion. And I think, you know, that to me looks like a happy marriage. So at number 1, I have the marriage between Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, as we see take place at the end of Jane Austen's novel Persuasion. If you watch my other video, you know Anne Elliot is my favorite heroine, and Persuasion is my favorite novel, and Captain Wentworth's letter is the most romantic thing that exists in any Jane Austen novel, and therefore you're probably not going to be surprised that I rank this as number 1. But I rank this as a number 1 because to me this seems to be the marriage that's among equals, the marriage which combines kind of all the other features of the marriages that I described as possibly being successful and good are combined in this relationship between Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth. Anne Elliot is smart, she is compassionate, she's capable, not just capable, she is incredibly skilled, she knows how to deal with people, she has a sense of loyalty, a real kind of fierce willingness to do what she wants to do, even if her family, who are kind of despicable, don't want her to do those things. And she realizes that she made a mistake by not marrying Captain Wentworth. The mistake wasn't in not marrying Captain Wentworth. Let me rephrase that. The mistake was in allowing herself to be persuaded not to marry Captain Wentworth for reasons that are not good reasons. That's the mistake, that she allowed herself to be persuaded to do other than the things she wanted to do. Now, you may not think that, you know, she should want to marry Captain Wentworth ever, but that's what she wanted, and she allowed herself to be talked out of it. Captain Wentworth has become much more successful in the gap between the initial romance between he and Anne when they were younger, and when we pick up the novel when I believe Anne is 27 and Captain Wentworth is 31-ish. He has hard feelings. He harbors resentment towards Anne because he really loved her, and she turned him down. And so it takes him a while in the course of the novel to overcome that resentment, but he does. And he realizes that he's still in love with Anne, and he is so in love with her that he's willing to take a chance on being turned down again. And he has good reason to worry that he might be turned down again. But he does, and she accepts, and you know, we get what I believe is the most happily ever after of all the stories. And the reason why I think this is the story in which I believe the marriage will work out best is that, you know, for lack of a better term, and I realize it's a cliched term, and today, thanks to, you know, constantly being repeated in media, it doesn't need meaning, but I can't think of a better term, but I would just describe them as soulmates. On some level, they connect. They connect in terms of their mind, in terms of their intellect, in terms of their character. They do have very passionate feelings about one another, and it's just the combination of everything. They love each other like Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney. They have the passion like Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. They have the admiration like Fanny Price and Edward Bertram, and it just kind of all combines to make what I believe would be the most happy marriage that Jane Austen ever set up in any one of her novels. Anyway, there you go. There's my evaluation of the marriages that are depicted, that take place in Jane Austen's novels. Let me know what you think and what your rankings are in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.